Hi, this is Emily Freitag, and I'm so pleased today to be joined by Dr. Candice Bocala, a lecturer at Harvard University's Graduate School of Education, and author of a book that has been a significant influence for us at Instruction Partners, the Internal Coherence Framework. And today we are going to be talking about rethinking intervention and what we know to be true about what works and what does not work in the act of supporting and accelerating student learning. So thank you so much, Dr. Bocala, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
With all of these, we've started in a personal place. I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey as a learner and what that has taught you about learning, and then get into some of your research.
So this is a really useful, reflective question, I think, for me. And in thinking about this today, I've taken myself back a little bit to what influenced some of the big ideas that I think I've been working on through different ways. I am the daughter of two immigrants from the Philippines, and they came over here to the United States in the 60s. I was born here, and my education has largely been in a predominantly white environment. I was a really successful student. And one of the things that stood out to me when I was reflecting back on this experience was the first thing was how few opportunities I had to interact with and learn from people who were from a different culture. Specifically, in my case, people who were also Asian American or Pacific Islander. That did not factor largely into my career, into my educational career. And it was not until I went to college that I had professors who were not white, who came from different cultures and different backgrounds. And so I think one of the things that has influenced some of my thinking is how important it is for students to see themselves in the educational system, and for students to have peers, mentors, role models, teachers who come from a variety of cultural backgrounds, specifically people who look like them and can honor and understand their communities and their cultural experiences. So that mattered a lot to me, and more than I think I realized. And I became really interested in education, partly because I wanted to make sure that there was another generation of students out there who, had a really rich and culturally sensitive upbringing and educational experience. A moment, I think, that influenced my personal educational trajectory was taking myself back to high school. I had a teacher who I really respected, and he was rigorous and held us all to very high expectations. He was the advanced placement English teacher. And he gave me the most harsh feedback on my writing that any teacher ever gave me. And at the time, I think I remember just feeling so crushed and feeling so discouraged. But upon having received it, he also gave me encouragement. And he said, this is going to be hard, but I'd like you to stop writing this in this way. And I want you to start writing in this other way. And so he didn't just give me criticism, he actually gave me feedback that helped me improve and helped me make my writing more successful. And so this moment actually really stands out to me in terms of my trajectory as a learner, because the importance of both feedback and support has been something that I've been really interested in for not just young people who are learners, but for adults who are learners. And how do we create organizational conditions in schools specifically where teachers get feedback and support to be able to improve. And that has influenced some of my work and interest in teacher learning, in teacher teamwork, and in how teachers improve their instruction.
That's so great. I'm brought back to an essay I wrote about the scarlet letter in 11th grade, hearing your story. And yes, it can be crushing, but so impactful. Well, let's use that as a bridge into your work. Tell us a little bit more about what you have researched generally, and specifically what you have found that works.
So my professional interest started out being in teacher learning. How do we support teachers to continue to learn and grow and develop throughout their careers? And this came from my experience as a classroom teacher and working at one point with a really diverse team of professionals. I was a special education teacher and all of my students had learning differences. And I worked with an occupational therapist and a speech language pathologist. So we all had very different areas of expertise. And when we came together as a team, it was a really powerful experience. But what I found is that very few teachers work on teams in a way that really enhances and enriches their instruction. More often, teacher teamwork is a place where teachers learn about the next staff meeting, or they plan a field trip, or they think about how to administer a test. They don't focus deeply, they rarely focus deeply on instruction in a way that helps them take advantage of the different elements of expertise around the table. And so my research was focused on how do teams of teachers really think about and improve their instruction over time. And so through that, I've been really interested in how teachers use data, not just assessment data, but all kinds of data, from student work to observations of students, to how do they take that and think about what do they do differently. My dissertation was about lesson study, which grounds teachers in real examples of student learning and evidence of student work, and then has teachers talk and engage in dialogue about content together in the presence of an instructional coach. And so there is always new expertise, new research that's being brought to the table so that teachers can generate ideas and together collaboratively plan their instruction. So I think one thing that I've learned from both the research and my own experience is that you can't just put people together in a team and expect them to really have rigorous conversations. There really needs to be a structure and a routine that supports teachers to use evidence. Not just testing data, but evidence of student learning. And there has to be some element of instructional expertise coming into that team, as well as the support for the teachers to be able to implement whatever it is that they agree upon.
That's interesting. Talk a little bit more about the instructional expertise and what that can look like.
So I've seen it a couple of different ways. One is in lesson study, it's often somebody who's a math or a science specialist. This is lesson studies more often applied in math and science. Somebody who's a content area specialist who understands how students develop a skill over time. So when teachers are observing a lesson together, lesson study is very public, and teachers go into a classroom and actually watch a teacher teach the lesson that they co-designed. And when they see where students are stuck and they see where the students have misconceptions, they bring that back to their next meeting and they wonder about that. I wonder why students got stuck here. I wonder why they have this particular misconception. An instructional expert, somebody who knows how skills develop over time, might say, well, given what we know about skill development in geometry or number sense, it makes sense that students are stuck here. So let's think about what's the next level of the student's development in terms of a learning progression or in terms of a next area of content that they might need to master.
So it sounds like it's pedagogical content knowledge, not just content knowledge.
Absolutely.
Okay, so through the lesson study with a team and instructional expertise, structures and routines that ground in evidence, what does that then lead to? What did you observe as the effect that had?
So one thing that happens in lesson study specifically is that teachers get better at talking to each other about their instructional practice. One of the historical detriments about the way that we've organized our schools is that teachers tend to operate in isolated ways. They tend to be solo practitioners. They tend to teach the way that they themselves were taught. We've all heard, those kinds of anecdotes. So what lesson study and other team-based professional learning opportunities do for teachers is it gives them a language of instruction and helps them talk to one another and bring in the different levels of expertise around the room to actually plan and do something different in the classroom, as opposed to just doing the status quo, doing what they've always done, or doing repeating a lesson the way that they think students should learn it, because that's how the teachers were taught. And by creating that deeper instructional conversation, it actually helps them to change their instructional practices in a way that other kinds of professional learning opportunities might not lead to. So if you have a teacher who goes off to a math professional development workshop, for example, but there isn't any of that team support or that follow-up, that teacher may go back to his or her classroom and just decide, oh, well, I'm not going to implement that because it's hard, or I didn't really understand that concept, so I'm not going to do it. Without the team, there's no level of almost like lateral accountability or reciprocal accountability, where now there's other people who are equally invested in my changing my own practice. And I also have a support system that I might not have had before. So what we're trying to get at is deeper student learning. If we don't have teachers who can teach at a high level of instruction, we won't get to that deeper student learning.
And can you talk about the role of curriculum in this, and what a curriculum, how a team interacts with a curriculum, or how you've seen it more productively done or less productively done?
So I think the less productively done interactions with curriculum are this idea of just implement by the book and pick something up and do it in your classroom without actually making sense of what it is asking of the student and what it is asking of me as the teacher. So in my work, I've seen really high level curriculum scaffolded so much that it takes the ownership and the agency away from the students. Let's say there's a very open-ended task and a really complex problem that the students have to solve. When teachers get nervous and they're not able to understand the kind of thinking that's required, they over scaffold. They take everything apart and do it piece by piece, and they take that level of cognitive demand away from the students. So what we found, and here I'm thinking about my experience in examining instruction through the DataWise project, is we found very often in examining instruction, teachers are doing all of the work, and students are following what it is the teacher is telling them to do in lockstep, but they're not actually engaging in that rich thinking. So teacher interaction with curriculum, teachers need to be able to make sense of the level of cognitive demand and how to keep that level high, keep the level of rigor high, and understand that they make decisions all the time that may change the level of that rigor.
That maps absolutely to observations that we've seen across classrooms. So what is it that leads to a teacher keeping that level high?
So I do think there is an important role for content and pedagogical knowledge, as you mentioned before, that we need to have coaches and instructional specialists who can help teachers understand that content and the level of rigor is part of how or the teacher needs to maintain that level of rigor through their presentation of content and not hold all of the work for the students. So somebody who can coach the teacher, who can help the teacher see that by letting the students struggle, it's actually supporting the students' development and getting them to wrestle with the content. So I think I'm a big believer in coaching and the idea that teachers, again, get feedback and support. So this probably goes back to that experience I had when I was younger. If teachers don't get feedback about what they're doing and how then to move their students to the next level, they won't know what it is they need to improve.
And so let's use that to talk a little bit about leaders and the role leaders play in creating the conditions for that kind of learning. What is it that you've learned and that may be the principal, it may be the leadership team, it may be a coach. I think, titles mattering less here than the kind of function that a leader has to play in a school.
So through the Internal Coherence Project, we worked a lot on leaders creating conditions for teachers to engage in the kind of learning that I've described. So in order to create those conditions, they have to do a few things. One is they have to be able to model learning themselves and to encourage a climate of what we call psychological safety. This comes from some good research by Amy Edmondson, among others. And the idea is that risk-taking is no longer seen as a detrimental, something that is detrimental. I can take a risk. I can try something new in my classroom. I can let my students struggle a little bit. And I myself as a learner, as a teacher, can struggle. And that will be okay. And so leaders need to create these conditions so that learning can occur. The other things that leaders can do is to organize around that powerful vision of instruction so that the teachers and the students are all moving toward the same kind of level of rigor and cognitive demand that is required of them. So by that, usually we talk about the instructional core. That would be a concept that comes from Deborah Ball, David Cohen, Richard Elmore, and Elizabeth City. And others who have written about the interaction of the learner and the facilitator in the presence of content. And so the idea is that if you organize around the kind of learning you want to see in the classroom at the most micro level, the rest of your school organization should match that. So we're not organizing around just getting students into smaller classes. Why do we want students into smaller classes? It's because we want more teamwork or student-to-student talk and less teacher lecture and more hands-on project-based learning, perhaps. So there needs to be a reason behind structural and organizational changes in a school, not just because we like to move the chairs and the furniture. It has to relate somehow to that vision of instruction that the leader has.
Which requires the leader to have a pretty significant instructional vision. Is that true?
Yes, yes. And when we talk about this in internal coherence, we talk about the vision being specifically about the content and how teachers are going to use the curriculum with students. So instead of a vision that is vague and it sounds nice and you might laminate it and put it on a wall, something like, we believe in learning for all students, or all students will achieve high outcomes. Rather than something vague, we actually ask that teachers articulate and leaders articulate what kind of interactions do you see in the instructional core as part of your vision?
It's almost like your walkthrough rubric is your vision more than a statement.
Right, right. Something that is specific to what is happening in classrooms.
In classrooms, yeah. And so one more note on this, like when you do see schools that really are organized around the core, what about them tends to look different than schools as we know school today?
I think one element of schools that are organized in a coherent way is a lot more common language and a lot more common understanding of what that level of cognitive demand should be in classrooms, so that teachers can talk to one another in concrete and specific ways, instead of being afraid to open up their classrooms or being afraid to say, of course my students are working at a high level, but not really allowing somebody to come in and actually watch that or see how that happens. So there's I think a common language that is created in those kinds of environments. Something else that we often do see again is this idea of psychological safety, where teachers are able to admit, I tried this new strategy and it didn't work for me, or my lesson really bombed the other day and what I need is I need help and I need some support. So they have that level of trust so that they can talk to each other.
So interesting, because I just made the connection in this conversation about the parallel that creates then for students and for student learning. So you're saying that's not just a nice to have as, you know, a kind of principle of a PLC, that's a need to have so that then teachers allow students to do that too.
Yes, there's a lot of parallel thinking in how I like to think about what matters for schools as organizations. So what matters for the adults in the building and the kind of learning and professional development that you want for your adults in the building should be really similar to the kind of learning and development we expect of our students. And that parallel structure holds up pretty well, I think, in terms of learning theory.
Interesting. What do we try that doesn't work?
So from my experience working on DataWise, what does not work is just giving teachers data without helping them understand the implications for instruction. There is a lot of criticism about data teams and teachers working with data. And at the heart of it, at the heart of that criticism is that data does not lead to differences in student learning. And it's true, without that rigorous conversation that teachers need to have and content and pedagogical knowledge, just giving them data won't help them. What we found in our research is that they tend to respond to data by making groups of students to regroup or to, again, focus a lot more on structure instead of the instruction itself. Now they have different groups of students, but the kind of pedagogy they're delivering may not be truly differentiated, but they've just put students into different groups. The other thing teachers often do when they have data is they just reteach or review the same thing they did before without actually changing anything. So they just say, oh, that group needs more of the same practice. And maybe they do for some skills, but often what happens is the students actually need that content taught in a different way. That's why they didn't master it the first time. So what doesn't work is just relying on the fact that teachers have the data to actually make that change in their instruction. The other thing that doesn't work is that we put teachers on teams, as I mentioned before, and we expect them to function and talk to each other without having some routines and sort of laying the groundwork to really focus on and look at student thinking in the classroom. We just put them together and say, go ahead and plan some great lessons. But I think that's the role, again, of a leader to establish the purpose of teams and to set up routines and give support to those teams so that they can have that conversation.
Interesting. And accountability at some level to how well they do that. Interesting. So take us into how this might apply to the coming year. It's obviously such a challenging time to be a leader in education, to be a teacher, to be a student. How do you feel like your work could and should inform the job that school leaders in particular are facing as they try to think about how to organize school for the coming year?
So I think it does go back to this idea of what do you want to see in the instructional core? And now it has changed in terms of the content delivery or the kinds of routines and schedules we'll have in our schools. So instead of delivering instruction in the classroom, we might partially be delivering it virtually. Or we may only have 10 students in a classroom with social distancing as opposed to 20 or 30 students in a classroom. So there are some structures that have changed, but what kind of learning do you want to see, and maintaining focus on that and allowing all of these different modalities to be in service of that vision. So going back to the idea that leaders need to be clear and communicate what that vision is and engage teachers in making sense of that vision, contributing to that vision. And just because we've changed over to a different format doesn't mean we let go of that. And maybe some things have changed for leaders in the interim. Maybe because of the pandemic, now we're focused a lot more on making sure that students have their social and emotional needs met in the classroom. So maybe before that was never part of the vision, but now it is. So let's clearly communicate that to our staff. The other thing that I think I would say from my research is, let's not forget about professional learning during this time, that we are very much focused on students, and we're very much focused on how the schools will be organized and what kinds of new routines will we have. But we're asking teachers to do things very differently than we've asked them to do before. And that's always true in any kind of school reform effort. You're always asking teachers to learn something new. And so now, after or during the pandemic, when teachers return to school, you're asking them to learn some technology or learn some new apps on their phones that students are going to use. And let's not forget about how we organize the adult learning in the building, and make sure that those adults, we're allowing the adults to not only have some agency over their learning, but also to grapple with and struggle with the complexities in the way that we're asking students to do so. So let's not just tell our teachers what to do. Let's engage them in making that sense and making that meaning, and trying to have some good conversations about instruction with our adults.
I think that, and doing it in new formats ourselves as adults too.
Right.
I do want to pull into our conversation. I think among many different roles you hold, you are a director, co-director of Reimagining Integration, Diverse and Equitable Schools. Can you tell us a little bit more about that project and any lessons it has, particularly as we think about increased inequity in light of the pandemic?
Yes, so we call that project RIDES. It's the acronym for Reimagining Integration, Diverse and Equitable Schools. And through RIDES, what we have developed is a framework that goes by the initials ABCD. And the idea is that when we look for environments that are truly integrated, meaning students of different racial backgrounds are all in the same space together, but often previously people focused on integration in terms of getting diverse students in the building without thinking a lot about their experiences. So the ABCD framework talks about the need for rigorous academics, that's the A, a sense of belonging, that would be the B. C stands for a commitment to dismantling oppression, specifically racial oppression. And D stands for an appreciation of diversity. So what we're hoping to do through this project is to work with schools to have those elements, to increase those elements in their environments. So when I think about coming back from the pandemic, or being in the middle of the pandemic, do our students all feel a sense of belonging? And how do we increase that? How do we help students develop a commitment to dismantling oppression? Well, there are all of these current events that are happening now in this present moment that serve as really good examples for students in terms of how do I take action, right? How do I learn more about my society, get engaged, and become more civically active? Those are really interesting and relevant lessons that teachers can bring in from the summer. When students come back, that will engage students in a way that probably just returning to, social studies as usual won't engage them.
Yeah.
So I think so RIDES tries to think about building, how do we build critical consciousness in our students to take action upon the world when they see injustice. And so I think those are a couple of ways that we consider I guess, how do we go about business as usual or not business as usual, I guess.
How do we find a new normal? Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Thank you so much, Dr. Bocala, for joining us on Rethinking Intervention and for all of your work. And we look forward to continuing to learn together over time.
Thank you so much. It's good to talk to you.